Hi everyone, in this video I'll be assembling my LS engine. Hi everyone and welcome to the channel about building a kit car and other car topics. If you like what you see, please subscribe and hit the notification buttons below and share with others on social media. So once I got done painting the engine, one of the little problems I always have is trying to dig into the engine before the paint's dry. And I really wanted to make sure I could leave this thing a few days, heat it up with some heat dishes, make it, kind of bake on there as best I can, and without, throwing it in an oven. And then, give it a shot. So I just left it sealed and pulled everything off. And here we are, taking all the pieces apart and starting the build. Again, I'm using the How to Rebuild GM LS Series Engines book, which is a step-by-step book, which has really worked out great in this situation, along with my machine shop that, sold me all the parts that I needed to actually put this thing together, and know that for the horsepower I'm doing and things of the such that this thing's going to work out the way that I want to do it. And what's also great about that is when you work with a local shop and you buy stuff from them, they're happy to answer questions when you're in a pinch and need to figure out what's going on. So that's a great part of it. So as you can see here, I'm taking everything apart. I'm cleaning it. The first thing that you really need to do is just verify your specifications. Now, you could sit there as a layman and say, well, the shop already did that. We should be in good hands, but it's always great to double check. And for me, I trust my shop. I'm not too worried about it, but I've never done it before. So I got the special strips that you put in there and you bolt it down and it squishes it in there, and then you measure it afterwards and see, how thick the line is. I kind of felt like I was going through formalities, and I'm not saying you should bypass that stuff. And especially if you're doing any kind of super horsepower build, this stuff all matters. But since I'm just doing a street engine, I was kind of doing a refresh. All I did was throw in a hot cam. I wasn't too worried about that aspect of it. But I did go through the motions. I did test everything. Everything was to spec, and better safe than sorry. So the bolts I'm using here are all reusable bolts, so I didn't have to worry about, torquing stuff down and having to throw those bolts out when I was doing my testing. And you can also see that it really doesn't take that much space to rebuild an engine. A nice little 4x4 area for the engine and its stand. And then I had another little 4x4 area for a table that had my books and all my parts. And have some oil nearby, have some cleaners nearby, have special, lubes that you need to put in there when you're putting in your crank and your camshaft and things like that. And some of your tools, and that's about it. Otherwise, you could do this in a small little space, and that was really nice. Of course, you're seeing my makeshift breaker bar there, that extra copper tube that I have that gives me just a little bit more leverage. Definitely needed to get to the pounds per square inch that I needed with the torque wrench. And again, not using any pneumatic tools while I'm building this engine. So one thing you notice is when you're doing your specs and your tolerances and you're bolting things down, this is not a short process. This is a long process. You install everything. You put the, little expansion strips in. You have to bolt everything down to spec. Then you have to double. Right now I'm measuring everything. You know, and I got this sped up like, I don't know, 6,000 or 12,000%. It's some crazy number. So, you know, what you're seeing here in 1 minute is something that took me an hour to do. And now I'm actually rubbing all that material off, which is part of the expansion to measure, you know, measure the tolerances. I needed to rub that all off the crank. So now I'm preparing some of the sensors on the side. I'm also adding some anti-lock and such to some of the side bolts that are going to go into the main caps. One of the things that you notice is I do all the cleaning here, and then I clean my crank, and then I'm ready to install the crank, and I slap it on the engine. Well, what I forgot was I didn't actually lube the bearings below the crank. Now that would have been a major error and could have caused a major failure when I first started this engine and got it rolling. So I corrected myself, got the special lube that you're supposed to be putting in, and that's the one thing is when you're first doing this, it's really easy to kind of be overwhelmed and like taking in all this information and make sure you're going through the steps correctly. And so you just need to take your time, go through the process, you know, make sure you're doing it one step at a time and follow through with everything. And with the caps, you know, there's so many bolts. There's a procedure of how to put it in, when to do the side bolts, when to do the top bolts, a special sequence on which bolts to tighten, in what order, with how much pressure, and then go back around at another pressure. And, you know, that's true for the heads. That's true for, you know, all these different areas. So once I got that in, now we had to actually put in all the bearings for the piston rods. And so the pistons were all connected already, but now I had to go through, add the rings, put in the bearings, and then lube and install. And once I got the first one figured out, then I was able to just do the next ones, you know, sequentially. And keep everything organized, and everything was still labeled so I knew which one went to which cylinder. There was 3 rings per piston that I had to put on in a certain sequence in a certain order. So now we're adding the bearings to the rods and just getting kind of everything set up first and getting the bottoms put in. or I guess technically it's the tops that I'm putting in. And then I'm going to come back, do the bottoms, put the special lube on, and then actually insert the piston into the engine. So now I'm lubing up the engine with some engine oil because we're getting ready to insert the pistons. And then this tool that I'm using to get the piston, to collapse the rings to get the piston in, I actually got a free rental from AutoZone to do that. Now one of the problems is when you're pushing that piston in, the rod area is open, and you want to make sure that as it's coming down it doesn't scar the actual crank, because it can be offset as it goes down. So you kind of get the piston started, and then you have to go below and guide, and that's why you see me looking down every once in a while. You need to guide the back end of the rod across the main crank, and then put the lower cap on and then bolt it together. And so I just kind of got stuff started and then kept working, and did 4 cylinders at a time, flipped the engine over and did the other side. But it was a little bit, I don't want to say scary or anything, but this is actually, I think, one of the most difficult areas to make sure you're not scarring your crank that you just got polished. Again, you can see how I put my hand into the bottom of the cylinder to guide that rod back over to the crank, just to make sure there's no scarring, everything is being seated the right way, and it's going in the right direction. Now we're going through the actual final torquing sequence, which you can see I'm putting some pretty good might into, and also putting my foot on the stand to make sure the stand doesn't roll around. It was actually a decent amount of exercise through this whole process. Also, when you're torquing, they give you a certain foot-pound specification, and then I'm actually using an angle meter to, they'll say, okay, go up to 45 pounds of pressure and then do 90 more degrees, or 45 more degrees, or whatever that specification is. So certain cases might have been like 60 degrees, and so I actually had to use an angle meter and start torquing that thing a percentage of degrees. Now we're doing all the main side bolts for the main caps, torquing those down. now we're actually doing the rod bolts. Now, I was just internally spraying the whole engine because I started noticing it was drying out and I didn't want anything to rust, so I just sprayed the whole inside. But what's happening this next day is as I'm torquing these bolts, I got into a situation where one of the rod bolt heads stripped, and it was already kind of torqued on, but it wasn't to full spec, and it looked like it could have shaved, some particles off of it. And so it became a real big issue. And you're seeing here, I'm using vice grips, I'm using channel locks, I'm using whatever I could do to try to figure out how to get this frickin' bolt out of the engine. And I couldn't figure it out. So I put the paper down to make sure no shavings go into it, and that way I just started torquing on this thing, and I couldn't get anything figured out. So then I couldn't sleep that night, and so some of this footage is actually from 3 a.m. in the morning, and all I'm doing is spending all this time trying to figure out how to get this bolt back off and get a new one, and I couldn't do it. So finally I called the machine shop and I said, I don't know what to do. I got this bolt on there, it's stuck, whatever. And they were like, just take a socket end and hammer it onto it and you'll be able to pull it right off. And sure enough, no problem at all. It finally came out. It was not an issue. So now what I was doing was some final touch-up paint work to some of the nooks and crannies that I didn't see paint in. And then at this point, you're always sealing the engine and keeping it clean and never letting it breathe overnight or anything. And now I cleaned the front covers and I'm getting ready to spray. So I'm going through the same process of doing a nice few coats on the primer and then coming back with the black and spraying some black on there. I love watching the time lapse of the paint being sprayed on. It's so cool looking. Do a nice second coat. And since these have so many different round edges and stuff like that, and it's very 3D product, I wanted to really get it on there nice and well. So that does it for this video. If you haven't seen some of my other LS videos, please check out the rest of the channel and hit the subscribe and notification buttons below. And until next time, have a great day.